Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new here. It is time for yet again another Spooktober true crime video. And today we will be talking about the true crime story that inspired the movie When a Stranger Calls and so many other movies. And let me tell you, this one is very, very frustrating. Today we will be talking about the murder of Janett Christman. So before we start this video, I'm not really sure if her surname is pronounced as Chrisman or Chrisman because honestly, I've heard both. But anyway, Janet was born on March 21st, 1936 in Missouri. She was the eldest of Charles and Lula May's three daughters, and her family owned a restaurant. At the time, Janet was about to turn 14 and was in the 8th grade. She was said to have a lot of friends and was well liked by her peers. She was also very polite and kept herself out of trouble. She did well in school and was also very active in church, where she was part of the choir. And since she was already 13, almost 14 at this point, Janet had also started babysitting and would earn money from this. She would constantly babysit for two families, the Muellers and the Romax. And she only babysat for these two families as her parents were familiar with them, and since Janet was quite young, they wouldn't allow her to babysit for complete and total strangers. And right from a young age, it already seemed evident that Janet had a very bright future ahead of her. But sadly, there would be no future for Janet. On March 18th, 1950, Janet's school, Jefferson Junior High, organized a dance, but she decided not to go as she accepted a babysitting job instead. In the morning, she received a call from Robert Mueller asking if she could babysit for him and his wife. However, Janet politely declined and told Mr. Mueller that she had already agreed to babysit for Ed and Anne Romack instead. Robert understood this, saying that he'd find someone else to babysit for them. After all, him and his wife were actually going out with the Romacks that evening. At around 7:30 p.m., Janet's dad Charles dropped her off at the Romacks' house, which was located at an isolated rural area. It was quite dark and there were not a lot of neighbors nearby. She was to watch 3-year-old Gregory, who was already fast asleep, and before Mr. and Mrs. Romack left, they gave Janet a few reminders. The Romax explicitly told Janet to keep the porch lights off and only turn it on when someone she knows is at the door. And of course, the same goes with the doors, to keep it locked at all times. Ed even gave Janet a quick lesson on how to operate the shotgun he kept near the front door just in case there was an intruder before they left her with Gregory. Janet stayed in the living room watching TV while little Gregory was upstairs in his room sleeping. It was a quiet, peaceful evening until it wasn't. At 10:35 p.m., a frantic phone call was made to 911. The woman on the other end of the line screamed, "Come quick!" But before the dispatcher could even ask for her location or what was going on, the call got cut. And this was in 1950. At the time, they had no way of tracing the location of the caller, and sadly, this 911 operator was not able to do anything to help this woman. At around midnight, Anne Romack decided to give her house a quick call to check on both Gregory and Janet. However, there was no answer. She figured that Janet, a 13-year-old girl, could have been on the phone with a friend to pass time, so Anne didn't really think much of it. An hour later, the couple decided to leave the party, and at 1:30 p.m., they reached home only to find the porch lights turned on. They were quite confused because they specifically told Janet to turn on the lights only if someone she knew was at the door. But then again, this was a teenage girl. Maybe she had a friend over to keep her company. That's what they thought. Ed and Anne weren't really that worried at this point. However, when they discovered that the front door was unlocked, this is when they started to doubt their initial feeling about the situation. They tried calling for Janet but was met with no response, and they would soon figure out why. As soon as the Romax entered their living room, they saw Janet sprawled out on the carpet, laying in a pool of her own blood. Gregory, on the other hand, was still sleeping soundly in his room. The Romax called the police immediately, and once the authorities arrived, it was pretty evident that the 13-year-old Janett Christman was beaten and strangled to death with a cord. Janett was positioned with her legs wide open, her skirt hiked up. She had bruises all over her body and had been hit on the head. She also had self defense wounds as well as multiple puncture wounds on her face and body, which seemed like they were done with a mechanical pencil. The landline phone was also off the hook and was found a few feet from her dead body, which would explain why Anne's calls never got through. It was then discovered that the cord used to strangle the poor girl was from an iron that was kept in Anne's sewing room, and the scissors used to cut this cord also came from that exact same room. One of the windows of the house was also shattered in with a backhoe, and near this window, a footprint was found. Now, here's the thing, all of this evidence seemed like this crime was done by someone who knew Janett and the Romax. First of all, Ed and Anne reminded Janett over and over again to only unlock the door and turn on the porch lights if someone she knew was at the door. And as I have mentioned earlier, the porch lights were on and the doors have been unlocked. The shotgun kept beside the front door was also untouched, therefore indicating that whoever did this was let in by Janett herself and that she didn't really feel threatened by this person and didn't feel the need to take and use the shotgun. Now, you might be wondering why I said that it seemed like this person was also known to the Romax. The iron and scissors were both kept in Anne's sewing room, and according to Anne herself, you would only find these items in that room if you were familiar with their house and had been in that sewing room prior to this. But what about the back window that had been shattered in? Completely staged, it seems, because the backhoe used to break the window was actually kept inside of the house. So this was a clear failed attempt of making the situation look like a break-in. Also, just a side note that there was a huge piano right under the window, and if anyone were to break in, they would have to step on that piano. However, there were no fingerprints nor footprints on it. Now, taking all of these evidence and information, the authorities were about to start their investigation. However, it wouldn't be that long before they were contacted by the Romax again. The very next day, Ed and Anne came in, not just with even more information, but a suspect as well. Remember Robert Mueller? The other guy Janett babysat for. Apparently, he called Ed very early the morning after the gruesome discovery and asked if Ed wanted him to come over. Upon being asked why, Robert simply said, "To help clean up all the blood, of course." And this sent a shiver down Ed Romax's spine. He knew right away that he was talking to Janett's murderer and rapist. Why? Because this case hasn't been announced to the public yet. At the time, the only people who knew were the Romax, the police, and Janett's family. So how did Robert know about this? Upon talking to the police, Anne also added that coincidentally, Robert also worked as a part-time tailor, and that the day before the murder, he had actually went to the Romax house to help Anne hem a dress at her sewing room. Aside from this, when the Romax found out that Janett had multiple puncture wounds from a mechanical pencil, they told the police right away that Robert never left the house without one. Ed also added another eerie detail. According to him, Robert was oddly very interested in Janet's. And yes, he knew her, but the things he said made it creepy and it didn't seem like he wanted to talk about it out of concern. He even came up with his own theory, telling Ed that in his opinion, the easiest way to get into the house and be let in by Janet without any question is if someone knocked and said, "Hey, Ed sent me here to get poker chips." Ed also mentioned that Robert, a 27-year-old man, had made disgusting comments about 13-year-old Janet's body in the past. But how would Robert be able to carry out this crime when he was with his wife and the Romax the entire night? Well, he wasn't. They were at a party, but somewhere in between, Robert was said to have slipped out for at least 2 hours, saying that he was going to meet a doctor who was going to tend to his son. And honestly, this was already sketchy because it was already late in the evening. And upon cross checking Robert's alibi, this doctor denied ever meeting up with him nor talking to him that evening. Now, with all this evidence piled up against him, plus those 2 hours that had not been accounted for, it was so obvious that Robert was their guy. He even called Janet that morning and knew where she was going to be, so solving this case should have been a breeze from here. However, that wouldn't be the case at all. In May of 1950, Robert Mueller was then brought to a barn where he was interrogated. Now, I have no idea why he was interrogated at a barn, but from there, he was then taken in to the police station where he passed a polygraph test. He was still put on trial, however, the grand jury couldn't really agree to one decision. Therefore, Robert Mueller, who was obviously Janet's rapist and murderer, was never charged with anything. And that's what makes this case so frustrating because all of the clues are there. It's so obvious, and yet he was never charged. 13-year-old Janett Christman, who was beaten, sexually assaulted, and brutally murdered, never got the justice that she deserved, and her family never got the closure that they needed. And after this whole debacle, Robert Mueller and his family simply relocated to Arizona, where he stayed until his death in 2006 at the age of 83. And I can't get help but get bitter about this case because Janet's life stopped at 13 and she had such a bright future ahead of her, while this man who obviously did it, who obviously raped, beat, and murdered this innocent child, got to live his life fully. He got to live until he was 86. He got to live a full life. Also, I heard that a few years after this, Anne actually passed away as well, and Ed remarried, and Ed passed away in his 90s in 2016. And honestly, I the Romax, they did everything that they could. They turned their friend in. They gave information that they did everything that they could to help solve this case. But Janet was failed by that grand jury who couldn't come up with a decision. And yeah, that is pretty much all the information that I have for today's case. I hope you guys found this video interesting. Please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you did and subscribe if you haven't. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to Janet's story, and I will see you guys on my next video.